Hi everyone, good afternoon. This is Kira Zegelman. I'm a Senior Manager at the Neighborhood Center for Partnerships and Innovation, and I want to welcome you all to today's webinar and thank in advance our moderator, Commissioner Ann Rendall, and our speakers today, Maggie McCary, Todd Olinsky, Paul, and Pat Stanton. So we will go right ahead and I will pass the mic over to Commissioner Rendall for an introduction.
Thank you, Kira. Good afternoon. With emerging technologies and changing customer demands, state energy efficiency programs are evolving in scope and size to encompass new goals. Some states have changed the definition of efficiency to enable new technologies to compete, while others have applied cost-benefit analysis or cost-effectiveness tests to utility programs to improve the prioritization of efficiency funding. Some states are developing methodologies to quantify the broader social, economic, and environmental benefits of efficiency programs. In Washington State, for example, the Commission and its staff have implemented or are looking at a number of these methods. We've used cost-effectiveness tests for decades, and we continue to refine their use in both program planning and evaluation. While we have not directly changed the definition of efficiency, we're looking hard at how demand response and distributed energy resources will be competing with standard energy efficiency, as well as utility scale generation. Our staff has been working over the last year with stakeholders to review the tie between existing state law and in following the guidance from the National Standard Practice Manual, we're reviewing the cost and benefits considered in cost effectiveness tests. Our staff were about halfway through this effort when the Washington legislature passed a number of bills in early 2019 that affect energy regulation. One of these is the Clean Energy Transformation Act, or Senate Bill 5116. So now we're pausing to incorporate these new requirements. For example, the bill requires the Commission to include public health costs and benefits in integrated resource planning, conservation planning, and other Commission processes and decisions. This highlights how important it is for cost effectiveness tests to be reviewed whenever new legislation passes. In this webinar, it will feature a detailed look at how Massachusetts is changing its approach to energy efficiency and will include a discussion of novel approaches in other states to advance energy efficiency programs. The panelists for today's webinar are Maggie McCary, who's the Energy Efficiency Division Director at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, Todd Olinsky Paul, a Project Director for Clean Energy Group and Clean Energy States Alliance, and Pat Stanton, Director of Policy for E for the Future. So we're going to begin with Maggie McCary. Maggie leads the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources energy efficiency policy and program efforts. She oversees innovative energy efficiency and peak demand reduction programs, grants to expand low and moderate income access to clean energy, support for zero energy and passive construction, and development of building codes and standards. So take it away, Maggie.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner, and thanks to NARG for organizing the panel. I'm excited to be here today to share some of the recent thinking here in Massachusetts around the future of our energy efficiency programs. Our recently approved 2019 through 2021 statewide electric and gas efficiency plans represent a pretty significant expansion and shift in the way we think about energy efficiency to drive new technology adoption and really invest in some new programs to deliver benefits to Massachusetts ratepayers and also to continue to align our energy efficiency programs with our state's broader policy goals. And so I'll start by spending a few minutes providing some context behind these changes, and then I'll walk through some of the programmatic shifts that we expect to see from our efficiency programs over the next 3 years. As background, the Department of Energy Resources mission, we're the State Energy Policy Office in Massachusetts, and our mission is to create a clean, affordable, and resilient energy future. And so this includes a broad range of policies and programs, one of the cornerstone policies being energy efficiency. And Massachusetts has really been a leading state on energy efficiency since the passage of our Green Communities Act back in 2008. And the Green Communities Act required our investor-owned electric and gas utilities to invest in all cost-effective energy efficiency that's cheaper than the cost of supply. And so that kind of founding legislation really has allowed us to see year-over-year increases in the investment and the benefits delivered by energy efficiency in Massachusetts. And we continue to invest in energy efficiency as a cost-effective way of reducing our energy usage, meeting our greenhouse gas reduction goals, while also supporting economic growth in Massachusetts. In the most recent Massachusetts Clean Energy Center jobs report, it documented that over 65,000 jobs in Massachusetts alone are related to energy efficiency. And so we see this as an economic driver in the state. Additionally, under Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act, we are required by law to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions 25% by 2020 and 80% by 2050. And energy efficiency to date has really been our single largest policy contributor to meeting those greenhouse gas reduction goals. And under the context of the Global Warming Solutions Act, DOER was tasked last year to develop a comprehensive energy plan, which really looked at what are our projections for energy demand going to be across our three key sectors, across the power sector, the transportation sector, and then our thermal and building sector out through 2030 and beyond, and look at what are the different policy strategies for meeting these energy demands, and how do we examine those policies in the context of our greenhouse gas reduction goals. And so what the study did, if you could just back up a couple slides. Keep going, one more. There we go. So what our study did was look at across those three sectors, where have we made the most progress and where do we need to continue to make progress. And so what we found is that our investment in renewable energy and in the power sector has done a significant job transforming and cleaning our electric grid. But we need to continue to focus on the buildings and the thermal sector to make sure we're leveraging those investments that we're making in the power sector. And so if you go to the next slide, the study looked at a few different policy scenarios of how do we balance costs, greenhouse gas emissions, and reliability of the grid to meet our long-term greenhouse gas reduction goals. And what the study found is that while we need to continue to invest in cleaning our power sector, we have to combine that with aggressive energy efficiency, conservation, but also fuel switching and electrification to make sure that we're leveraging those investments. And while we do that, the study found that we need to address peak demand as we continue to increase our electric load through building and through transportation electrification. And so this concept really kind of sets the policy framework for how we think about what role our energy efficiency programs have to play to help us meet our long-term greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. You can go to the next slide. And so we were lucky last year in Massachusetts, the legislature actually passed a bill called an Act to Advance Clean Energy in the summer of 2018. And that bill clarified and actually expanded what the allowable investments were under our mandated energy efficiency programs, and actually really helped us align with those policy objectives that I just mentioned. And so the bill specifically, the original bill in 2008 required all cost-effective energy efficiency and demand reduction. But what last year's bill did was it expanded what the allowable investments are for the utilities in the energy efficiency programs to include things like active demand management, where we're actually allowing investment in helping customers shift load away from peak. It specifically called out energy storage as an allowable investment under our energy efficiency programs. It called out strategic electrification, where that minimizes costs and greenhouse gas emissions for customers, and also importantly allows fuel switching under the energy efficiency program. So instead of only thinking about our programs as reducing electric consumption, we can now think about how do we get customers to potentially fuel switch to efficient or clean sources like cold climate air source heat pumps. The second thing that it did is it broadened our electric efficiency plans to no longer be only focused on electric, but to actually be broadly focused on energy. And I'll get into some details about how that plays out in our next 3-year plan. But what that means is we had to really rethink how do we set the goals for the program if the primary goal now is overall energy reduction and not just megawatt hour electricity reduction. And then the last thing that the legislation did was it changed the Department of Public Utilities cost effectiveness review. We use the total resource cost test here in Massachusetts, and historically that had to be met on a program level, but it actually raised the cost effectiveness review to the sector level to allow for more flexibility within programs. Next slide, please. So that legislation actually helped us think through the next 3-year efficiency plan and how we align it with our broader policy objectives. But it also helped us here because as we thought about the next 3-year plan, we also faced a significant challenge with regard to residential lighting and continuing to deliver the same level of benefits to customers over the next 3 years that we have historically. And that's because on the residential lighting side, historically has made up about 80% of the residential electric savings for our energy efficiency programs. But going forward, you'll see in the bar chart on the right that the expected savings from lighting is going to decline significantly. And this is a good news story. This is related to rising baselines, federal efficiency standards potentially coming into effect, and broad adoption of LEDs in the residential sector. But what that means is in order to continue to deliver the level of benefits and continue to invest in energy efficiency for customers in Massachusetts, we really had to rethink what are some of the innovative approaches and new technologies and new programs that we should be adding in to continue to deliver benefits as residential lighting savings in particular are going away. You can go to the next slide. And so what we did was we undertook a pretty significant stakeholder engagement process to develop the 2019 through 2021 plan. On the gas side, we actually don't see some of the challenges that we see on the electric side with regard to savings declining over the next 3 years. And so we were able to set higher gas savings goals in this plan than the previous one. And we'll continue to invest in weatherization and other measures on the gas side. But on the electric side, in reflection of the change of expanding the electric programs to really focus on energy efficiency and not just electric efficiency, we actually developed a new savings framework in Massachusetts for the electric program administrators. And instead of having one primary metric around megawatt hour reduction, we've developed a multi-goal framework for the next 3-year plan that includes an overarching MMBTU reduction metric that will reflect electric savings, it will reflect delivered fuel savings like oil and propane. And then we're maintaining a megawatt hour reduction metric to make sure we continue to invest in aggressive conservation of electricity. And then we've added a peak demand reduction metric that actually now includes active demand management and not just passive peak reduction through energy efficiency. And so what we ended up with was a 3-year plan that will result in about $2.8 billion of investment in energy efficiency, but expected to deliver about $9.3 billion worth of benefits. And importantly to note with the benefits number, and Todd may touch on this, I think this is the first 3-year plan where the Department of Public Utilities here has actually adopted a new avoided cost or benefit associated with avoided greenhouse gas emissions as another way to continue to align our efficiency program with our broader policy objectives. You can go to the next slide. And so with that as a frame, I'll walk through basically 3 of the key programmatic changes that we are seeing over the next 3 years. And so the first is peak reduction. And so while we'll continue to focus on energy efficiency, the programs are really shifting to focus on reducing energy when it is most expensive and has the highest emissions for customers. And so in the 2016 to 2018 plan, we actually ran demonstration projects to test out some active demand management programs. And so now as part of the next 3-year plan, since we were able to prove those out as demonstrations, we'll be rolling out statewide active demand programs. And I know Todd will be getting into some details on these, but these go across all sectors. On the residential side includes direct load control programs through things like Wi-Fi thermostat set points. And then on the C&I side will include things like manual load curtailment, and across both sectors will include new incentives for energy storage that I know Todd will get into detail on. One important thing here is that because the active demand reduction programs are new and they're not as developed as the more traditional energy efficiency programs. The Department of Public Utilities here actually approved a new component of the utility shareholder performance incentive to specifically incentivize utilities to achieve benefits associated with active demand management. And so we'll continue to see lessons learned over the next 3 years as these programs expand. In 2019, they'll be rolled out statewide, but we expect to see continued increase in the size and volume of these programs as we get into the out years of the plan. One other lesson learned here is as we thought about energy efficiency and really expanding the definition and expanding the program, you start to engage different stakeholders that haven't historically been engaged in energy efficiency. So one important lesson learned through the planning process was to make sure that we were engaging the storage industry and other clean energy industries that haven't historically been engaged in energy efficiency, and make sure we bring them into the fold, talk through program design and goals. And that's something that I think helped through the planning process and will hopefully help as we roll out these programs over the next 3 years. You can go to the next slide. The second main focus I want to highlight is a focus that we have on winter reliability. This is a little bit of a specific problem to Massachusetts and the region here, but in the winter we use natural gas as our primary heating fuel in the thermal sector, but also for electricity generation in the power sector. And so we really wanted to focus the next 3-year plan on driving even more natural gas savings to help us in the winter when we have extended cold periods and have strains on our natural gas. So we'll continue to focus on gas savings. The other thing that we're really trying to do starting in this winter is utilize some of the active demand and demand response programs that are usually run in the summer, and actually try to start calling events in the winter to help during these cold periods. And so these are electric active demand programs that will be including energy storage that will be dispatched by the utilities in the winter. One thing I will note is that our Department of Public Utilities, in their order approving this plan, actually have directed us and the utilities and the program administrators here to start thinking about gas demand response. But in this current plan, we'll really be focused on monetizing the benefits and testing out dispatching of assets and demand response during the winter. You can go to the next slide. And then the last shift I want to highlight in terms of programs is fuel switching. And so, as I mentioned earlier, our electric programs have been broadened to include an overall MMBTU reduction goal. And that helps incentivize the utilities to invest in helping customers convert from higher greenhouse gas intensive fuels and higher cost fuels like oil, propane, and electric resistance heat, and help convert them to more clean and efficient technologies, for example, what's shown here, air source heat pumps. And so there are significant increases in the incentives now in Massachusetts for customers that are looking to convert to air source heat pumps, and the utilities are working on identifying other technologies as well that could fit in here. And this was really a direct result of the legislation that allows the utilities, instead of just looking at customers using their existing fuel types, they're actually able to claim benefits and savings associated with the offsetting of an existing fuel. So for example, a customer that currently heats with oil, the utilities here will now look at the savings, not just the electric impact, but look at the reduction in oil usage from converting a customer. And so we're working on rolling this program out this year, both on the residential side, low income, and commercial industrial. And we actually set specific goals for the program administrators for heat pumps over the next 3 years that we'll be tracking towards. You can go to the next slide. So the last slide is just a summary of some of the new initiatives. I've talked about most of them. I think the only last thing I'll add here is a lot of what I've talked about is existing buildings and homes and retrofit. But of course, there's a lot of opportunity in new construction to drive technology innovation and really deep energy efficiency. And so we're exploring ways to do that, specifically through launching a new incentive program this summer for passive house design and construction. to really, especially in the multifamily sector, to really encourage deep energy efficiency in new construction. And so as we move forward, we'll continue to examine all the benefits of these new programs and continue to find ways to really broaden our reach and participation and make sure we're on track to achieving the new goals that we've set forth over the next 3 years that we hope will really deliver significant benefits to ratepayers, but also finding ways to really innovate and incentivize new technologies in the program. So I will stop there and turn it back to the Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. That was great. Now we're going to turn to Todd Olinsky Paul. He conducts policy work for CEG's Resilient Power Project, supporting state policymakers and regulators in integrating behind-the-meter battery storage into state policy and programs. He also directs CESA's Energy Storage and Technology Advancement Partnership, a federal state funding and information sharing project that aims to accelerate the deployment of electrical energy storage technologies. Todd, now you're up.
Okay, thank you very much, and happy to be here. I will skip quickly over a few initial slides so as not to repeat too much what was already said, but I do want to just say Clean Energy Group is a small nonprofit located in Vermont. We do a lot of work in states with clean energy offices, and we've specifically done a lot of work in Massachusetts and around New England over the past few years on energy storage, which is my focus area. And I also want to mention that in this presentation, I will be including some economic analysis results from the Applied Economics Clinic. We contracted them to perform some analysis for the report that you see on the screen now that I'll be speaking to. And that work was conducted by Liz Stanton and Brenda Woods at AEC. So, as I said, I'm speaking to this report. It was just published in April, so it's still pretty fresh. And basically, the report tries to cover 4 points. First of all, to explain the process that Massachusetts went through in incorporating battery storage into its energy efficiency plan and how other states can do this. Secondly, to discuss some best practices in battery incentive design. Third, to introduce storage cost-benefit analysis, and that's the economic analysis I just mentioned. And that is in order to be able to meet required cost-effectiveness screens that states apply in efficiency and in other types of clean energy programs. And then fourth, in this report, for the first time, we identify and then assign values to 7 non-energy benefits of energy storage. And I'll go into that a little bit more later. Next slide, please. So I want to give a little bit of background, and as I said, I don't want to reiterate what's already been discussed. Just briefly, the groundwork for this work was actually laid in I believe as early as 2008, when the Massachusetts legislature incorporated peak demand reduction into the efficiency program as a legitimate efficiency goal. Now, there's been a lot of other legislation in Massachusetts that specifically states that energy storage can be used for this purpose in the efficiency program. Recommendations from the State of Charge report to incorporate storage into the efficiency program, et cetera. The important thing is that there legislatively was groundwork laid for this. And when we came into this process, what was needed was an economic analysis showing that storage passed the total resource cost test, which is the state's cost effectiveness screen. Next slide, please. So, so the two main sort of conditions that need to be met for states to replicate this. One, to redefine efficiency, and when I say redefine, it's really expansion. The sort of traditional definition of efficiency as reducing net consumption is perfectly good and valid and terrific. What needs to be done is to add on to that the idea of not just reducing net consumption, but also shifting consumption from times of high demand to times of lower demand. And this provides a lot of benefits and efficiencies that reducing overall net consumption without changing the shape of the demand curve doesn't provide. Secondly, as I stated, showing that storage is cost effective is important because it has to pass that test in order to be eligible for inclusion in these sorts of programs. Next slide, please. So I'll take these one at a time. Redefining efficiency. If you look at the sort of diagrams, it's not, it's fairly straightforward. Traditional efficiency reduces net consumption. It doesn't shift peaks, typically. It shifts the entire demand curve downward. But the peak is still in the same place. Peak demand reduction, which energy storage happens to be very good at, doesn't reduce net consumption necessarily, but it can very effectively shift the shape of the load curve so that you're charging at times of low demand, you're discharging at times of high demand. This reduces those peaks and tends to flatten those curves out a bit. Next slide, please. And the key point here is that not all demand hours have the same value. This is a chart from the Massachusetts State of Charge report. It shows the demand curve for the state of Massachusetts across an entire year. And you can see that the blue lines are high in the middle of the year, between about the middle of the beginning of July through about the middle of September. And that's because like most of all of the Northeast, Massachusetts is summer peaking, and you get these peak demands in the summer when everyone turns on the air conditioning. And what this study, State of Charge, found, and this was commissioned by DOER and Mass CEC, what it found was that 40% of the entire annual cost of electricity supply in the state is attributable to 10% of the hours in the year. So those few peaks in the middle of this chart are really costing almost half of the total spend for the state in electricity. So they really have an outsized cost. And the other way to look at this chart is the white space is really inefficiency in the system, because the entire system is sized to meet occasional peaks. When you have demand that's significantly lower than those occasional peaks, you get these white spaces in the chart, and that's just inefficiency in the system where you have essentially overbuilt your system because you had to, but now you have large portions of this system sitting idle, whether that's generation or transmission or distribution. It's sitting idle because those peaks are so infrequent. Next slide, please. And so the monetizable value of storage really comes in primarily in addressing those peaks. So I already spoke to redefining efficiency. I won't belabor this. We'll just go on to the next slide. This is just showing some of the legislation that addressed this topic. And I want to get on to what we did to show that storage is cost effective. Now, to qualify for the state energy efficiency plan, storage had to pass the TRC, total resource cost test. So we contracted with the Applied Economics Clinic. They produced for us this report, which was published in July of last year, and basically looked at behind-the-meter battery storage in both the low-income and the commercial industrial sectors. And what they found, and this is the results here, is that the benefit cost ratio for low income is 2.8, and for commercial industrial was 3.4. So what's that telling us? That for every dollar you spend, you're getting back between $2.8 and $3.4 in benefits. Next slide, please. Now, following our publication of this result, the utility program administrators in Massachusetts did their own benefit cost calculations for energy storage, as they had to, and this is their result. It's a little harder to read and a little complicated, but basically the numbers in black are the ones that are positive, and the numbers in red are not. So anything above, anything a score of 1 or above is a positive outcome. So not every program in every utility territory came out with a positive number, but the vast majority did. And those numbers range from, well, from 0 essentially up to 6.2 in terms of benefit cost ratio. You might also notice there's a big donut hole in the middle. It says no LMI program offerings. That's because they didn't, as far as I can tell from this, they didn't conduct cost benefit analysis for the income eligible sector. That's the low income sector in the state's energy efficiency plan, and we felt that was a that was an omission that shouldn't have happened and should be corrected. And I'll get to that a little more later. Next slide, please. So there's a few things to note here, but I wanted to first give you the results of this entire exercise. Once everyone had done their cost-benefit calculations and the program had been hashed out, the current state is that for the first time ever, the Massachusetts 3-year energy efficiency plan includes behind-the-meter storage as an active demand reduction measure. The incentive really isn't an incentive, it's actually a performance payment. There's no upfront rebate offered. What is offered is a payment based on average load reduction over a period. And there are approximately $13 million in these payments allocated over 3 years, and with the expected result from our calculations of about 34 megawatts of new behind-the-meter storage being deployed. As I said, there are some shortcomings, notably no carve-out for low-income customers or enhanced incentives for low-income customers. There's no upfront rebate. And there are numerous omissions in the way these BCRs were calculated, which means they are likely way too low. And I'm going to go over that. Next slide, please. But I wanted to just, before I do that, point out what the rates are. Now, this is a National Grid slide from a recent webinar that they participated in. And you can see that in Massachusetts, for commercial customers, they're offering a $200 per kilowatt compensation rate for load reduction in the summer, and a $25 per kilowatt rate in the winter. And if you look down at residential, it's just slightly higher, $225 per kilowatt in the summer and $50 per kilowatt in the winter. And customers can also participate in other programs like the Smart Solar rebate with a storage adder. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give an example of how this works, because the way this works is a little is not entirely intuitive. As I said, the incentive is based on an average load reduction performance. So if you had a 60 kilowatt hour battery and you're responding to peak demand calls from the utility to dispatch that battery, and those calls are 3 hours long, and that's important. So for over a 3-hour period, that 60 kilowatt hour battery is going to be able to respond on average, at best, 20 kilowatts per hour for 3 hours. So you take that 20 kilowatt response, multiply it by the $200 incentive rate, and you end up with a $4,000 maximum payout for the season. And that's assuming that you respond perfectly to every call and that your battery is fully charged each time and fully discharges over 3 hours. Now, if that duration of discharge were reduced to 2 hours, that same 60 kilowatt hour battery could earn more because the average load reduction over 2 hours would be 30 kilowatts instead of 20, and that would go into your payout calculation. Next slide, please. Now, as I said, there were some omissions, and I'm only going to speak to 3 of them. So go right on to the next slide. First thing I wanted to speak about is that there are too many peak hours in the year. And this goes back to the way that utilities traditionally think about peak and off-peak periods, at least in Massachusetts. Peak is considered to be basically daytime. I mean, utilities basically considered peak to be 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. every weekday, summer and winter. So that means there are almost 4,000 peak hours every year and almost 5,000 off-peak hours every year. And this is useful, I guess, from the utilities perspective, but from the perspective of a storage owner, it really isn't of the way to think about things. What you really want to do is target those 10% of peak hours. The 3-hour peaks during the summer, hottest summer days really is what you want to target. If you look at the chart, the tables here, if you define peak in this way as being almost half the hours in the year, then reducing those peaks is only worth about $47 per kilowatt. And if you look at how that changes, if you define it as the highest 10%, either by energy price or megawatt hour in the year, it goes way up to $80 for energy price, or $73 for the megawatt hour or demand calculation. Okay, next slide, please. So we need to think about how peak is defined. If you're targeting peaks, you need to target the real peaks and not half of the year. Next thing, winter reliability. This was touched on already, but essentially there is no value right now in Massachusetts for winter reliability. It's assumed to be 0 when they did the calculations. Therefore, we need to look at that, and we will be taking a look at that, as well as the PAs are supposed to be taking a look at that. And next slide, please. I just want to also mention that non-energy benefits were not included in the benefit cost calculations that were done. Non-energy benefits are incorporated in Massachusetts for energy efficiency measures, and they should have been incorporated for storage as well. Next slide, please. And so we went ahead and commissioned the AEC to look at what some of those non-energy benefits might be worth if they were considered. And so here's a list. This is also part of our report. It's in the appendix if you want to go look at it. But basically, this includes things like higher property values, avoided fines and collection fees, job creation, reduced land use, avoided outages or resiliency. And each of these things has a value, and these values need to be considered if you want to really look at the cost-benefit calculation for energy storage. You need to look at all the benefits, not just a narrow range of benefits. Next slide, please. So I am winding up here in a minute, and I apologize for running a few minutes over. Basically, what we're suggesting is that states expand the definition of efficiency to include peak demand reduction, fully integrate demand reduction measures, including battery storage, into their efficiency plans, develops incentives, and these incentives should include an upfront rebate as well as performance incentives, access to financing, and adders or carve-outs for low-income customers. Next slide, please. And then build on this economic analysis. We've done a lot. There's a lot more to do. I wanted to mention that there have been a couple other efforts at doing this kind of cost-benefit analysis. They're listed here. Connecticut Green Bank did one. San Francisco Department of Environment did one. Interestingly, they're all similar. They range, in the same kind of area here, from up to $5 or $6. So it's an interesting case. We would love to see more cost-benefit analysis done in different areas of the country, so that we get a broader sense of what storage is worth in different markets and using different cost-benefit tests. Next slide, please. So I think this is my last slide. I just want to point out that incorporating new technologies into energy efficiency plans is a best practice. It's something that has always been done, and we get new, higher efficiency systems, lighting, HVAC, all kinds of improvements in the technology, and we incorporate them, and that's what is supposed to happen. So we think energy storage is the next logical step here, to increase energy efficiency gains and to start to get at those peaks and not just limiting ourselves to reducing overall consumption. So thank you very much, and I'll pass the torch back to the Commissioner.
Thank you, Todd. Appreciate it. Now we'll turn to Pat Stanton, who is a nationally recognized award-winning expert in regulatory policy analysis and advocacy. She works tirelessly to improve public policies related to energy efficiency, renewable energy, and the full range of demand resources. Prior to working at E4the Future, she served as policy advocacy lead at CSG and led a consulting service for clean energy market participants. Before CSG, she was deputy commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. Pat?
Thank you very much. I want to thank Todd and Maggie for giving us such a great background on what's happened in Massachusetts. I am here to provide some insights to you folks on the phone who aren't from Massachusetts and who may be asking yourself, well, why should my state want to consider integrating demand energy resources into their programs? I work for E4the Future, which is a policy NGO, and as full disclosure, E4 worked hard for passage of the law in both 2008 and 2018, and we're also working to see that other types of DERs, not just storage, are included and incorporated into the EE programs. But that's not my role today. My role today is to be a little bit more of a devil's advocate, to ask a question about why incorporate these technologies into energy efficiency programs. Next slide. So if we go back when most of the Public Utility Commission's charters were written, we had a very simple grid, central station, transmission, distribution, and end users. And it wasn't really until the early 1990s that Public Utility Commissions thought of much of anything besides universal access and rates. And the whole movement for energy efficiency hasn't really been around that long. And we've all been dealing with cost effectiveness analysis for energy efficiency since then. So I see the question about now, as we're saying, well, should we incorporate more things into these energy efficiency programs? I see it as a sort of two-part question. Next slide. First of all, the world's changing. Lots of things are being attached to the grid, whether we like it, we as regulators like it or not, both a generation, different kinds of uses. So it's more complex, lots of new technologies. Next slide. And consumers are rapidly adopting all of these various kinds of technologies. So as the demand energy resources and new telecommunications are more ubiquitous, customers want to use them in different ways, and public utility commissions are having an interesting question of grappling with not only having these things connected, but is having them connected or having them used in a particular way actually in the public interest. Next slide. So as Todd showed, both Maggie and Todd showed, the results of the question of whether something was in the public interest, was addressed in Massachusetts, and determined that including storage to address peaks would be in the public interest. So I think then the really interesting question is, does it make sense to integrate that desire to encourage customers to make those kinds of investments? Should that be integrated into traditional programs, or should we be developing parallel programs? So next slide. I'd say from the perspective not of Massachusetts, but from the many states where I've done work over the years, my response would be it's less about dividing up a finite pie and thinking that diverting, as the traditional EE folks would say, diverting funds from the traditional programs to these new programs, that many states do not have the kind of expanding all cost-effective mandate as Massachusetts, and achieving new money for these programs is going to be needed if there's going to be major new deployment. So I think that's really the primary thing, is that if it's determined to be in the public interest to have more storage, as an example, then funds to motivate consumers to adopt that storage would need to be found. And then in addition, you need to figure out how you're going to manage those programs. So next slide. I think that there are, in fact, some really good reasons for incorporating the projects together rather than to have parallel programs. One of the major speaking points that we had from E4 as we were talking to legislators last summer about incorporating DERs into the EE program was to reduce consumer confusion and to assure that regulators worked hard to integrate things. Also, I think, next slide, energy efficiency, the cost effectiveness is a really big issue. And I did want to mention a couple of other examples that you may want to check into. Recently, a small utility in New Hampshire has received permission from the Public Utility Commission to have a residential storage program. And the entire purpose is to reduce those peaks and lower the overall cost of energy that this utility purchases off of the market to support its customers. This particular program is not so integrated with the energy efficiency programs, so it's a case of where it's been determined that it would be cost effective and beneficial to encourage and incentivize customers to do storage, but it hasn't been integrated into the program, the other energy efficiency programs. Another example that I think is really interesting is that in New England, the system operator, the ISO New England, has a capacity market, and in the most recent bidding auction to participate in the forward capacity market, Sunrun won a 20 megawatt obligation in the capacity market, and that is going to, they're looking to integrate storage and solar in residential setting in 4 states, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And this is a case where actually the government didn't determine that it was cost effective, or the Public Utility Commission didn't. Given the way the market is structured, this private company has figured out a way that they think they can put together a business proposition to deliver capacity into the system operator. Now, they will certainly take advantage of any of the programs for residential battery storage in Massachusetts, for example. But the program itself is for delivering this combined solar battery system in Massachusetts is not integrated or wasn't initiated or integrated in the energy efficiency program, but was created by a private company. I did want to take one side step to mention the standard practice manual for cost effectiveness determination. This is an E4 initiative. We manage the project, and we are in the process right now of starting a stakeholder group to expand the National Standard Practice Manual for doing cost effectiveness determinations for EE, and we're expanding that to cover distributed energy resources. So we'll be looking at storage and solar and various other things. And if anyone is interested, we can certainly make sure that you get the connections to that information. And as every state representative on the call knows, every state's cost effectiveness determination is slightly different depending on historically what's been considered. And we're we think that the standard practice manual provides a real guideline for your state to incorporate into your cost-effective analysis the policies and objectives that your state has. Next slide, please. So back to the beginning, and my basic question is, so if you've decided that, and your state thinks that there are applications for storage or other DERs that are in the public interest, and the state decides they have resources, they found some money for incentives to encourage people to to do more of that activity, why is it beneficial to think about integrating the energy efficiency, the DER program with the energy efficiency program? Next slide. So it's really simplification. Certainly from the perspective of the customer, customers are building owners. They could be residential building owners or other building owners. It's really good to not have to kind of hunt around and hear about, oh, there's this loan program from this agency over here, or there's this other agency where you can get something for solar. So I know when we were lobbying in the State House for the passage of this legislation, we were very much pointing out the importance of having it be coordinated outreach to customers and not have customer confusion. And one of the speaking points was to not have dumb stuff happen. Even in Massachusetts, which has been rated at the top of the ACEEE scorecard, we had a solar program, incentive program developed in one part of the government, and the traditional energy efficiency programs overseen in another part, and completely unintended consequence where you could get a low or no interest loan to insulate your attic, or you could get a low or interest loan to put a solar on your house, but you couldn't get a loan if you wanted to do both. So having the programs integrated gives the staff, the administrators of the programs, the opportunity to minimize that kind of confusion and increase the probability that there will be good opportunities, a better experience for customers. Next slide. And I think it's always humbling to remember that the traditional, in many states, people haven't adopted a lot of the energy efficiency initiative technologies that have been around for a long time. In order for our systems to get the benefits and lower the costs, we really need to encourage homeowners and building owners to adopt these technologies. And having less confusion is a really important aspect of getting adoption. And with that, I'll turn it back to the Commissioner.
Thank you, Pat. And to Maggie and Todd, these have been great presentations and have given us all some insights and probably sparked a few questions from those on the webinar. So I'm going to turn this over to Kira. I think we have time for a few questions. And take it away, Kira.
Yes, so the slide here tells you how to ask a question. We've received a couple that have been written in earlier in the webinar. So I think this one is aimed at, I think both of these are aimed at Todd, but the other panelists can feel free to weigh in. I'll just read off both questions now. First, for Massachusetts, why not extend the policy to off-peak time of use rates or demand response instead of just storage? And secondly, we got a request for Todd to expand on the recommendation that utility ownership of battery storage be limited.
Sure. Well, for the first one, it's not just storage. I spoke about storage because that's what we're focused on. In fact, the program is an active demand reduction program within the efficiency plan, and other types of reduction can qualify. So, for example, if you had a wireless thermostat and you could turn down during peak times or something, that might qualify. Maggie may have more information than I do on what the various technologies that qualify are, but it's not just storage. However, we think that storage offers a lot of other benefits in addition to the peak shaving or peak reduction benefit, and that it's important to begin to incorporate it in particular into these programs. As to the other question, utility ownership is something that is kind of the gorilla in the room that nobody's really talking about. There are states where, like Massachusetts, where utilities are not able to own generation, but they are able to own storage without any restrictions. And that's partly because storage is a kind of a new thing, and there's been some question as to how to categorize it. It acts like generation sometimes, it acts like load sometimes, it acts like a distribution resource sometimes. And so I think that there's been kind of a general sense that, if utilities are willing to go out there and develop it, then great, and let's worry later about who gets to own the benefits. And I think that we shouldn't leave that question till later. It's fine for utilities to be out there, investing in the storage market or responding to procurement targets, but there needs to be some discussion about how to avoid a monopoly situation down the line where, a third-party storage developer can't compete with the utility that's also developing storage, because the utility is also controlling things like interconnection. and rates. And so I think that's an important discussion that, you know, we didn't really have time for on this particular webinar, but that states should really start thinking seriously about. And it's important to ensure that customers and third parties continue to have the ability to own storage and the storage attributes. And there's actually been some dockets in Massachusetts that have started to address this issue.
Thanks, Todd. I'm afraid that's all we have time for, as it is 4 o'clock on the East Coast here. Before we wrap up, I did want to mention our next webinar coming up in this series. It will be on July 11th, and it is on cybersecurity fundamentals driving infrastructure resilience. You can register for that at nabruc.org/CPI. So thank you again to all the panelists today, Todd, Maggie, and Pat, and thank you to Commissioner Rendall for her moderation. Hope to talk to you all next month, and to see everyone at the NARUC Summer Policy Summit on July 21st through 24th in Indianapolis. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.